Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Yongnuo YN 56mm F1.4 DA DSM WL Pro. This is the third entry in what Yongnuo is calling their Commander series, and so it has featured a 23mm, 33mm, and 56mm now f1.4 lenses, all of which are able to be wirelessly controlled and will eventually be available in Sony E, which I'm reviewing here today, Nikon Z, and then Fuji X mount. Now, as we're going to see, this is an incredibly feature-rich lens, and it can be had for around $270 US. And so that makes it a very compelling option if you're looking for a telephoto portrait prime lens for your APS-C camera. So is this the 56mm lens to buy? Well, that's what we're going to explore in today's review, right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the Fantom Tracker. Are you someone prone to misplacing your wallet or bag? If so, the Fantom Tracker card is definitely for you. This credit card size tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and functions like an Apple AirTag. It can be locally tracked via a 95 decibel beeping noise that can be heard up to 300 feet away, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My network and its map. Unlike many other trackers, the Fantom Tracker card has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge will last up to 6 months. The low price of the Fantom Tracker makes it a perfect gift, and you can save even more by visiting store.fantomwallet.com and using code DUSTIN20 at checkout. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off.
So we'll start by taking a look at the build and feature set here. This is a 56mm lens, and so on APS-C cameras, which all of these platforms have a 1.5 times crop factor, it means that that is an 84mm full frame equivalent. So obviously that is probably the most popular focal length for portraiture because it allows you to have a long enough focal length and a fast enough aperture to blur out backgrounds, but it's not so long that you can't use it in a normal size room. And so that makes it a very useful lens. Now, as noted, the full name of the lens is a mouthful. Yongnuo 56mm f1.4, in this case it's S, or for Sony, DA, DSM, WL, and Pro. So again, to break down what all that means, S stands for Sony, or Sony E-mount platform here. DA stands for the fact that it is APS-C. For whatever reason, that's their designation. DSM refers to digital stepping motor, which is the focus motor. WL refers to the fact that it can be wirelessly controlled. And Pro is what they have applied to their kind of line of lenses that have a little bit more upscale build and have some additional features over the cheaper lenses. Now, as noted, it is very feature rich, and we'll get to that in a moment, but that does come at a little bit of cost in it being a little bit heavier. It's also got a aluminum alloy casing, so we've got metals rather than plastics, and that even lightweight metals do tend to weigh a little bit more than plastics. And so this lens weighs in at 368 grams or 13.1 ounces. To give you some perspective, Sigma's 56mm f1.4, it weighs in at 280 grams, and so it is considerably lighter, almost 90 grams lighter. But the Fuji 56mm f1.2 WR, a little bit faster maximum aperture, but a more similar feature set, it actually weighs considerably more. It's 45 grams. And so, I mean, this lens, I think, probably sits at about where it should, but obviously if you're looking for the lightest possible 56mm f1.4, there are lighter options in this. The dimensions of all of these Commander series lenses are identical, 69mm in diameter or 2.7 inches and 87mm or 3.4 inches in length. All of them share a common 58mm front filter size. And one thing that is unique when you look at the front of the lens that is still very rare is they actually have the Wi-Fi logo on there. And that is a reminder that this lens is Wi-Fi compatible to allow you to have that remote control. Now, outside of the remote control, obviously if you're not interested in that, just in the features that are on the lens itself, we do have a robust approach to aperture control, aperture ring, and so you can have it clicked, and when clicked, it's got the 1/3 stop to tense, and then a more rigid stop in between f16 and then automatic mode, which you can switch into if you don't like aperture rings. It also has a declicked mode, which will allow you to quickly and smoothly rack through those aperture options. Now, I will note when doing aperture racking, you can see there's some visible steps, even though you can declick it. It still is pretty obvious when you're making moves, so I'm not sure how valuable that is going to be for aperture racking. For me, myself, I found that to be quite obvious, whereas there are other lenses where I can smoothly do that, and if I'm careful, I can avoid any of those kind of visible steps as the aperture changes. So unfortunately, it's not this linear moving throughout the aperture. It still kind of moves in stops along the way. So, take that for what it's worth. It does have a function button on the side, and obviously that can be programmed to whatever function you have set in the camera. And then also it has a custom switch with 2 different positions on it. So that will allow you to select something like AF/MF, but also it can be used as a part of the wireless control, and they have a process by which you can enable wireless control and kind of a cycle of setting that up. And once you have done that, you can then use that to switch into the time when you want to use the lens wirelessly. It does have 9 aperture blades. In theory, they're rounded, but in practicality, they're not very round, as you can see. And as the aperture stops down, you can very clearly see the aperture blades. And so it doesn't do a great job. If the purpose was to have that keep circular looking specular highlights, it doesn't do that very well. Like all of these lenses, it does have a port down here near the mount, but not on the mount, for where there's a USB-C port that's hidden behind that. It has a gasket to keep weather sealing. Unfortunately, that gasket, as with all of these, is very difficult to get out. You're going to need something, either have very long fingernails or use something small like a flat-bladed screwdriver with a small head to pry that open, and be careful because that gasket comes completely out. And you're going to want to stick it back in there after you've done things like firmware updates, and so you don't expose it to losing the weather sealing, because it does have some weather sealing, at least in the form of a gasket here, and then it does have a flooring coating on the front element. So again, for a lens that's at this price tag, it's pretty great to have any form of weather sealing and definitely flooring coating on there. As noted, it does have a metal body, and the lens actually feels pretty upscale in terms of the overall construction. The manual focus ring is located near the front. The damping is fairly light on it, but it did focus fine. When I used it manually, no real problem there. Minimum focus distance here is 50 centimeters, and that gives you a 0.11 times magnification. I'll note that both the Fuji and Sigma lenses that I've mentioned allow you to get a higher level of magnification, 0.14 times. However, this is enough to be useful. As you can see here, it does a pretty decent job up close. So overall, this is a really compelling package. There really isn't anything that I have seen on APS-C at this focal length that has a more comprehensive package of features and options there. And so kudos to Yongnuo for giving us a lot of value for the money when it comes to the overall features. So let's talk about autofocus. Autofocus comes via that DSM or digital stepping motor. And again, I've never figured out what the difference between a digital stepping motor and a typical stepping motor is, but that's part of the Yongnuo thing. What matters is that autofocus for stills is quite good. And you can see here that focus transitions back and forth, they are really snappy, and no issues with that. Focus is very quiet, it's confident, it's accurate. And I found whether shooting indoors or outdoors that focus just quickly locked on and did so accurately. It was fast enough that even at f1.4, I was able to pick up bird in flight and lock on and get accurately focused, so no problem there. Whether it was human or animal subjects, it didn't matter. I got good eye detection, and so again, that worked really well. And so overall, focus speed, focus sound, and focus accuracy, all good for stills. On the video side of things, I found that video pulls were largely good. There's not really any kind of visible stepping. I did see just a little bit of a micro adjustment sometimes at the end of the focus transition, but overall that was pretty good. There is some more obvious focus breathing than what I saw on either the 23 or 33 millimeter lenses. Not surprising with this having a longer focal length. And I will note here on Sony that because this is a third-party lens, there will be no focus breathing compensation. That's reserved only for Sony lenses. And so don't depend on that to smooth out some of that focused breathing. You can see here from my hand test that it mostly went well. Transitions are not jarring, they're relatively smooth. However, I needed to pause an extra beat before I moved my hand or put it back in place because it wasn't always as responsive as what I would like in transitioning to my hand. But I did find in other video clips that video F was largely good, and it also stayed stable when I was just shooting static shots where I wanted focus to be stable throughout that. So overall, autofocus works really quite well here. So let's talk about the optics, and I'll give you my overview here, and then the deep dive breakdown, as always, is going to be at the end of the video. Optical design here is 10 elements in 9 groups. 5 of those, as you can see from this diagram, are various exotic elements. You can also see that the MTF is quite consistently good. There's a little bit of dipping up and down, but it stays relatively flat across there. It's not as sharp, not at a high level across as what, say for example, the Viltrox 56mm F1.7 Air series lens is, but that lens is quite exceptional in that regard. But overall, this sharpness is pretty close to all of the top competing lenses that it would come up against. I would say that there is one kind of significant optical flaw that I can point to, and that is when you're shooting at wide apertures, there definitely is some fringing, particularly in high contrast situations. Going back to the shot of a bird in flight, if I go into just a full pixel level, you can see definitely there's some fringing around the edges of the bird. And I also found that in other shots, shooting, for example, here down towards the beach in Myrtle Beach, you can see there is some fringing again if we punch into 100% magnification. And that definitely showed up on my chart test as well, some obvious loca or longitudinal chromatic aberrations. There's a tiny bit of lateral style chromatic aberrations, but nothing that's going to be any kind of real issue there. Now, for those of you that are interested in full frame coverage, it isn't much more than the APS-C image circle, so I wouldn't recommend it for that purpose. You can see there's some hard mechanical vignette over basically everything outside of the APS-C image circle. When it comes to distortion and vignette, there is some moderate pincushion distortion. I needed a +10 to correct for that. It did correct in a linear fashion, and so won't be any kind of problem. And of course, the correction profile for JPEGs and videos will happen in camera and will help to offset that. Vignette is really quite minimal, only a +32 to correct for the vignette, at least here on Sony. Expect, as is often the case, it'll be a bit higher on either Nikon or Fuji mounts, but here on Sony, it is quite minimal. My chart test results showed very good results at f1.4, consistent across the frame, good performance. And as I looked back and compared to some of the other lenses, 56mm lenses I've tested, this is a good performance. In some ways, it looks a little bit better in the real world, but this is testing at 26 megapixels, which is the maximum on Sony. It's going to look a little worse if you're shooting on the Fuji 40 megapixel sensors, but that's always the case. And so that is a very, very demanding platform. And so lenses tend to look a little bit softer there. Out in the real world, as noted, results look good. In those high contrast situations, the fringing will reduce the apparent sharpness a bit. If you're in lower contrast situations, it looks fantastic. I do see some boost to contrast by f2, as you can see here. By f2.8, even the corners are looking really quite excellent. And of course, that means that at landscape apertures, you can get really great detail all across the frame, no issues there at all. Good performance, whether you're shooting in the center, the mid frame, or off into the corners. It'll stay very similar to that through f8. At f11, you start to see a little bit of softening due to diffraction, and at f16, that will become more noticeable. Now, bokeh quality is overall, I would say, pretty good. I don't love specular highlights because they do have some green fringing if you're shooting at the wide apertures. I also note that I haven't yet seen, outside of the Fuji 56mm f1.2, typically these 56mm lenses are not as good as what full frame 85mm lenses are when it comes to the bokeh rendering. You can see that quite obviously in this comparison with another full frame 85mm lens, that just the background is much smoother from the 85mm full frame lens. But when I compare it to the bokeh quality from outside of that Fuji, which is much more expensive, when I compare it to the Sigma or the Viltrox, I would say that the bokeh quality is pretty decent here. Likewise, flare resistance is pretty good. You can see, for example, in this time lapse, as the sun comes up, it stays nice and stable. In the midday when I shot right into the sun and I put the sun up into the corner, you can see a little bit of a flare pattern coming down, a ghosting pattern that's coming down. But for most ordinary shots, I found it to be just fine. I find that the colors from Yongnuo and their optical glass, they are good, but they're not great. And again, this is a budget lens, so it's about what I would expect. But images look good. I think that most people will be happy with them. So my conclusion is this. I think chief advantage of this particular lens is that it does have a more robust feature set than basically all of the other 56mm lenses. And when you combine that with the fact that you're getting a really competitive price tag of around $270 US, that means that you're maybe getting more bang for your buck when you consider that both the autofocus and the image quality performance is all quite good as well. Now, if you are looking for the sharper lens, I would say that the Sigma 56mm F1.4 DN is a little bit sharper. It also costs twice as much and has fewer features. The Viltrox 56mm F1.7 Air, it's only F1.7, but it's a strong value because it's really good optically if you don't really care about the features, and it's also lighter, and so if that's a priority, then you can go that way. But if you're looking for kind of the mid-level in terms of price, but then being really quite set with the features, then the Yongnuo really stands its own and has kind of a unique niche there. And this whole series, the 23mm, 33mm, and 56mm, have all been uniformly really quite great. And so if you're looking for a series of matching lenses, it's an easier recommendation for those. If you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There are buying links there as well. And now if you want even more information, dive into the optics together with me, and let's do that deep dive.
Okay, we'll start by taking a look at the full frame coverage. And so you can see here there is that hard mechanical vignette because the whole full frame image circle is not being covered. So if I cycle forward to where I've cropped off most of that, you can see here's what it looks like. And then this is the APS-C crop, and I'll toggle back and forth. So you can see we're going a little bit wider, but not probably enough to be meaningful to actually affect. I certainly wouldn't buy it to shoot it primarily on full frame. Now, taking a look at vignette and distortion, there is some pretty obvious pincushion distortion here. It's a -10 to correct for that. Vignette here on Sony is quite low. I used a +32 to correct. You can see everything corrects nice and clean, even doing it manually. However, there will be correction profiles to clean all of that up. As noted, the weak spot here is the fact that there is some pretty pronounced fringing. And so you can particularly see that green fringing after the plane of focus showing up pretty obviously. And here in high contrast situations, I saw a little bit of fringing, as you see on those transition areas, some purple fringing over the wings. Likewise, in a shot like this, you can definitely see looking through this zone in those really high contrast areas. There's definitely some fringing that are going to show up. So not perfectly corrected in that regard. So here's a shot where it's obviously much lower contrast. And you can see as we go throughout this image that, the detail actually looks, even at f1.4, looks really good throughout the frame. And that's because you're not losing things to fringing in the same way. So, it goes to show that even the fringing is pretty situational, but just something to be aware of. Lateral style chromatic aberrations are pretty well controlled. I do see just a tiny bit here. This is so minimal here though, and at such high level of magnification, you're probably not going to see much of any of that in the real world. So this is 26 megapixels on Sony, and we're looking at 200% magnification. You can see in the center of the frame, there's good detail and good contrast, not like exceptionally good, but very good. You can see in the mid frame, not a whole lot of drop off there. And as we pan on down, we can see that, it's a little bit softer from upper corner to lower right corner. But down here, we can see there's actually been a little bit of a bump back up, as the MTFs suggest. Actually looks really quite good there in the corner. Looking up here on the upper left side, also looking good. And so we can see we've got a good centering performance here with good consistency everywhere that we look in the frame. Here's a real-world f1.4 shot, and you can see, nothing to complain about there when it comes to the detail that's available at f1.4, looking really quite crisp. Now, there's not a significant difference by f1.8. By f2, you can start to see increasing contrast, looking better there as we look into this zone. It's not exceptional yet, but if you look at the word Canada, for example, at how much better the contrast is in the dark areas compared to this zone here. Now the big jump comes at f2.8, and you can see just how much crisper it is on the right at f2.8. And now we've got a pretty consistent performance, I would say. We look up here into the upper left corner. You can see really good detail. It's crisp, good contrast, lower right corner. Again, really good detail right off there into the corner. Stopping down to f5.6 shows another pop, particularly here into the corner performance. I don't know if you're going to see it quite as much in the center of the frame, maybe a little bit deeper contrast, maybe a little bit here in this mid-frame zone, but you can see that really in the corners is where we're seeing the most significant uptick. I'll give you a couple of real-world examples here. At 100% magnification, you can see really good detail here in the center of the frame at this shot, and it continues on right off to the very corner there, looking nice and crisp. From up above, I'm able to get a pretty flat plane of focus, and you can see right off into the corners, this gravel, everything is looking really nice, good detail there, right off into the very edges of the frame, and so a nice performance all around there. By f11, you'll see a little bit of softening due to the effects of diffraction. However, that'll be more pronounced at the minimum aperture of f16. I would probably avoid f16 unless you're just desperate to get a deeper depth of field, because otherwise you are going to get noticeably softer results. The level of magnification, as we've already noted, isn't exceptional. Up-close performance is decent, but what you can see is there's definitely a little bit of that fringing that is impacting in this particular example here. And so it's okay, but it's not great. Here also up close, this is at minimum focus distance. And again, I don't think the detail is too bad. I don't love, some of this fringing, as I've already noted there, but I also don't think this, in the three-dimensional result, it's looking too bad. What I don't love is even by f2, you're seeing those aperture blades, and f2.8, even stronger, more pronounced. I showed you the example comparing in the actual review with the full frame 85mm lens. But if you just take a look at this shot on its own, detail looks good on the subject. Like, I'm happy with that. This zone looks a little on the busy side to me, so there's a little bit more hard edges than what I would like. This shot here, I think, is just more advantageous. It shows the background's a little bit further away, less in the transition zone, so it looks quite a bit creamier. Here, like a table that's off in the background, it's blurred out enough in this portrait shot that everything looks pretty soft in the background. Here, if we go back a little bit further from the subject, so things are a little bit more in focus, but again, I don't see anything really that I'm concerned about in this particular shot. There's a little bit more edges like on the chairs around that table, but again, it's not bad. Again, this was the worst example that I saw with the flare, with that bit of a ghosting pattern there. But in less extreme examples where I'm not shooting right into the midday sun, you can see here that there really isn't anything marring the image. And so flare resistance overall, I would say not bad.
And so as you can see, this is a lens that really holds up quite well in a lot of different categories and can produce some beautiful images. Thanks for watching to the very end. Have a great day and let the light in.